She was gone. Not taken, not missing. Gone. On her own terms, in her own silence, with nothing but a single handwritten sentence left behind on a marble counter that cost more than most people's cars. Dante Moretti had buried men for less. He had toppled governments with a phone call. He had walked through fire and never once flinched. But standing in that hollow penthouse at 4 a.m, staring at his wife's empty walls, he felt something he hadn't felt since childhood. Terror. If this story hits you somewhere deep, stay until the end. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this one travels. Hit like. And let's begin. The elevator opened directly into the penthouse, the way it always did, smooth and silent like everything Dante Moretti owned. The kind of silence that costs money. The kind that tells the world you've arrived somewhere most people will never be allowed to go. He stepped out at 4:12 in the morning, jacket loosened, tie pulled down 2 inches, the faint trace of a woman's perfume on his collar that wasn't his wife's. He didn't bother hiding it anymore. Hadn't bothered in a long time. There was no one home to hide it from, or so he believed. The penthouse was dark except for the ambient glow of the city bleeding through the floor-to-ceiling windows. 42 stories of glass and steel separating him from the rest of Chicago's breathing, struggling, ordinary world. He moved through the entryway without turning on a light. He knew every inch of this place, every corner, every shelf, every piece of furniture that had been chosen by an interior designer he'd paid $50,000 and then never spoken to again. He moved toward the kitchen, and that's when he felt it. Not saw, felt. Something wrong in the air. The specific gravity of a room where something is absent that should be present. He'd developed that instinct over 30 years in a business where reading a room wrong could get you killed. His body registered it before his brain caught up. A prickling across the back of his neck, a tightness in the chest that he initially dismissed as the bourbon from earlier. He reached for the kitchen light. The walls were bare. He stood there for a full 10 seconds, just staring, because his mind genuinely refused to process what his eyes were showing him. 4 paintings had hung on the wall facing the kitchen island. He'd never paid particular attention to them, never asked about them, never commented on them. But they had been there every single day for 11 years. Elena's paintings, the ones she made in the first years of their marriage, before she stopped painting altogether, and he'd never thought to ask her why. Now there were 4 pale rectangles on the wall where the color had been slightly protected from the years of light. Ghost shapes. Outlines of something that used to live there. He walked into the living room. More bare walls. The photographs were gone. The framed ones on the console table near the window. The wedding picture that had sat on the bookshelf in its heavy silver frame. The candid shot someone had taken of them in Venice 11 years ago when they were still the kind of people who took candid shots in Venice. Gone. All of it. The shelves looked like a mouth with half its teeth knocked out. He opened his mouth and closed it again. He walked down the hall. He opened the door to the master bedroom. Her closet, the walk-in that connected to the bathroom and that he had learned years ago never to open because she'd been irritated once when he'd moved a dress to find his cufflinks, stood wide open and empty. The rods were bare. The shelves were bare. The little velvet tray where she kept the earrings he bought her for anniversaries was gone, along with the earrings. He stood in the doorway of that closet for a long time. Then he went back to the kitchen because somewhere in the back of his mind, something was telling him to look at the counter. He didn't know why. Instinct again, maybe. Or just the fact that Elena had always been a woman who believed that if you had something to say, you said it clearly, without theater. The note was small, folded once, his name written on the outside in her handwriting, which was careful and even, and had always reminded him of a schoolteacher's. Deliberate. Unhurried, as if every letter had been thought about. He unfolded it. 1 sentence. I'm done. The divorce papers are waiting. Don't look for me. He read it 3 times. Then he set it back down on the counter, very carefully, as if it were fragile, as if it might break. He pulled out the bar stool and sat down, which was something Dante Moretti almost never did in his own kitchen. He didn't cook. He didn't linger. He passed through kitchens the way men like him pass through most spaces, present without being there, occupying without inhabiting. He sat in that kitchen until the sky outside the windows began to turn gray, and he did not pick up his phone, and he did not call anyone, and he did not move. Her name had been Elena Vasquez before it became Elena Moretti, And for the first 23 years of her life, the name Vasquez had meant something to her. Her father's hand smelling of turpentine, her mother's voice reading to her in Spanish on hot summer nights. A small apartment in Pilsen where the walls were covered not with expensive art, but with her own drawings tacked up with the kind of enthusiasm that doesn't know yet to be embarrassed by itself. She'd been a fine art student at the Art Institute when she met Dante. 23 years old, he was 31, already running significant portions of his uncle's operation, already wearing suits that cost more than her tuition. He was not what anyone would describe as handsome in any soft sense. He had a face that had been broken and reset, dark eyes that missed nothing, and the particular physical stillness of a man who has learned that most situations resolve themselves if you simply wait long enough and refuse to be the one who speaks first. She had found it compelling. She was 23. She found a great many things compelling that she would spend the next 14 years paying for. They were married inside 18 months. Dante moved fast when he wanted something, and he had wanted Elena with the single-minded focus he applied to everything, utterly, completely. And then, once obtained, with a gradually diminishing attention that she had spent years trying to pretend wasn't happening, she gave up the fine arts program in the second year of their marriage. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself she'd go back. She kept her sketchbooks, kept her paints, kept the idea of herself as an artist tucked in the back of her mind the way you keep a photograph of someone who died young, present, beloved, but no longer part of the living world. Dante never told her to stop painting. He was too smart for something so obvious. He simply never asked about it, never asked to see what she was working on, never noticed when the canvases disappeared from the spare room that had briefly been her studio and became, eventually, a storage space for things neither of them wanted to make decisions about. The marriage ran on a kind of surface politeness that outsiders mistook for happiness. He was never cruel in any way that left marks. He provided. He appeared at the right functions. He remembered her birthday in the sense that his assistant sent flowers and he signed the card. He was present in the way that a very expensive piece of furniture is present, large, impressive, and fundamentally immovable. She had tried in the earlier years to reach him, to have the kind of conversations that she'd imagined marriage would contain, the honest ones, the uncomfortable ones, the ones where you actually say what you mean instead of performing a version of yourself you think the other person expects. Dante didn't operate that way. Every time she tried, he would look at her with an expression she came to think of as his boardroom face, patient, closed, waiting for her to finish so that the situation could return to something he understood how to manage. She stopped trying around year 7. By year 10, she had become, in many ways, two separate women. There was Elena Moretti, the wife of Dante Moretti, elegant, composed, present at every dinner and every charity event and every family gathering, a woman who knew exactly what fork to use and never embarrassed anyone and managed the penthouse and their social calendar with the quiet efficiency of someone who has made peace with a job they didn't apply for. And then there was the other Elena, the one who existed in the gap between sleeping and waking, who still dreamed about paint-stained hands and the particular smell of a studio in the afternoon and the feeling of making something from nothing. The second Elena had been very patient. The second Elena had also been paying attention. It was a Wednesday in November, almost 18 months before the night Dante came home to bare walls and a note. Elena had come home early from a charity board meeting, headache, the beginning of the kind that sat behind her left eye and pulsed like something trying to get out. She'd dismissed the driver 3 blocks early because she wanted the cold air. She let herself into the penthouse, and she was already unbuttoning her coat in the entryway when she heard voices from the direction of the study. She recognized the voice immediately. A woman's voice. Low, deliberate, with the particular cadence of someone making a calculated effort to sound effortless. Isabella Laurent. She knew the name. Everyone in their social world knew the name. Isabella was 31, French-educated, the kind of woman who wore her ambition the way other people wore perfume. Not hidden, not loud, simply constant. She worked in some capacity for one of Dante's legitimate business fronts, something involving international finance. Elena had met her at 3 separate events, and each time had registered the way Dante's energy subtly shifted in Isabella's presence. Not dramatically, not obviously, but there, the way a compass needle shifts near metal. Elena stood in the entryway of her own home for somewhere between 15 and 30 seconds. She was very still. The coat was half unbuttoned. Then she walked forward because she was not a woman who walked away from things she needed to know, even when she desperately wished she were. The study door was open 4 inches. Through those 4 inches, she saw enough. She saw Dante's face. She had prepared herself on some level for this possibility, had imagined it in the sleepless hours in various forms, had imagined his expression in the caught moment as something she could work with. Guilt, panic, shame, the human reflex of a person suddenly aware they've broken something important. Those were expressions you could respond to. Those were expressions that meant something remained to break. Dante's face, in the moment before he registered that she was there, held none of those things. He looked inconvenienced. That was the precise word that came to her standing in the hallway with her coat half unbuttoned and a headache pulsing behind her left eye. Not ashamed, not panicked, inconvenienced. The expression of a man who had just discovered a scheduling conflict, a minor logistical complication in an otherwise well-managed day. She turned around and walked back down the hall. She went into the master bathroom and she ran cold water over her wrists, the way her mother had taught her when she was a girl and the summers were brutal, and she looked at herself in the mirror for a very long time. She did not cry. She thought, I've been gone for years. I just didn't know it until now. The plan took shape slowly, the way everything Elena did took shape, deliberately, without rush, in the private hours when Dante was occupied with his other life. She was meticulous by nature, which had served his world well and would now serve her own. First she found a lawyer. Not a divorce lawyer, but not yet. A woman named Carol Breyer who specialized in something she described as high-conflict exit planning, which meant she had spent 20 years helping women leave situations that were complicated by money, power, and the kind of men who did not take refusal well. Elena found her through a referral chain so long and so carefully constructed that tracing it back would have required knowing who to ask, and no one in Dante's world knew to ask those women. Her first meeting with Carol Breyer lasted 4 hours. He'll have people looking for you within hours, Carol said, over coffee in an office on the north side of the city with no signage on the door. Men with his resources always do. I know, Elena said. Then we need to make sure that when he looks, he finds nothing. And we need to make sure that legally you are fully protected before you go anywhere. How long? Done right? 4 to 5 months. Elena sat with that. 5 months of going home, 5 months of having dinner across from him, attending his events, sleeping in a room down the hall from him. 5 months of being Mrs. Moretti while becoming, quietly, in every hour she could carve out, something else entirely. Okay, she said. The attorney looked at her carefully. This is a man with significant criminal exposure. Do you know the extent of it? Elena looked back at her. I know more than he thinks I do. For 5 months, Elena Moretti performed the role of Elena Moretti with a precision and emotional discipline that might have been the finest work of her life if anyone had been watching closely enough to recognize it for what it was. She attended the charity gala in December and danced with Dante's business associates and laughed at the right moments. She hosted Christmas dinner for 31 people and managed the seating arrangement and the menu and the coat check, and she smiled for every photograph. And in every photograph she looked serene, which is the thing she would later recognize as the performance's greatest achievement. Not the smile, but the serenity, the absolute unbroken surface. Dante noticed nothing. He continued seeing Isabella. Elena knew the schedule without trying to know it. She had always paid more attention than anyone gave her credit for. She processed this information the way she processed most uncomfortable realities at that point in her life. She filed it, she used it as fuel, and she did not let it touch the surface. In February, she signed a lease on a small apartment in a coastal town called Harrow Bay, a 4-hour drive from Chicago, a place where the nearest person who moved in Dante's world was approximately 300 miles away. The apartment had 2 bedrooms and a west-facing window, and the landlord was a retired school teacher named Howard, who accepted the first and last month's rent in cash without any apparent curiosity about why. She began moving things when Dante was out of the city, a box at a time. The sketchbooks first, 12 of them, going back to before they met, the record of the person she'd been before she started editing herself for his world. Her mother's jewelry, which had lived in a shoebox in the back of the closet because the pieces were too small and too personal to wear in the life she'd been living. The painting supplies she had quietly restocked 6 months earlier from a store in a neighborhood she'd never otherwise visit, paying cash. She took nothing he had bought her. Not the jewelry, not the clothes, not the Hermes bags or the fine watches or the cashmere. None of it. She took only what had been hers before him, and she took the evidence. Because in those 5 months, Elena had also been doing something else. She had always had access to more of his financial world than Dante intended. Not because he trusted her with it, but because powerful men often become careless about what they leave visible to the people they've stopped truly seeing. Bank statements, account numbers, shell company documents whose names he cycled through in conversation when he was tired and forgot to code switch. The offshore accounts whose existence she had intuited years earlier and confirmed slowly, carefully, document by document over the course of months. She photographed everything with her phone. She organized it in a folder stored on a device that was not connected to any account Dante could access. And then, in the last weeks before she left, she had a long conversation with Carol Breyer about what to do with what she had. She did not want money. She did not want revenge. She wanted one thing, to be unreachable, to leave this world in a way that guaranteed it could not find her, could not follow her, could not pull her back the way these worlds always tried to pull people back. The only way to do that, Carol had said carefully, was to make the world she was leaving too busy to look for her. Elena thought about it for 3 days. Then she called the number Carol had given her. The last morning began like all the others. She woke at 6. She made coffee. She dressed in one of her ordinary weekday outfits. Nothing that would stand out. Nothing that he might later connect to the moment of departure. She moved through the penthouse with the steady, unhurried pace of a woman who has made her peace and is simply waiting for the clock to reach the agreed-upon time. She left the note on the kitchen counter. She did not look back at the penthouse. She had already said goodbye to it privately, weeks ago, had walked through each room alone one afternoon and released it, the way you release a breath you've been holding too long. She took the elevator down. She walked through the lobby. The doorman, Marcus, held the door for her, and she thanked him, and he said, "Have a good day, Mrs. Moretti." And she smiled at him, and she did not correct him. Her car was parked 3 blocks away. Not her car. A used Honda she had bought in cash in January, registered in a name structured through Carol's office. Ordinary. Invisible. She put the suitcase in the trunk. She placed her legal folder on the passenger seat. She took the old bottle of perfume, the one she'd owned since before Dante, her mother's scent, something simple and inexpensive, and she put it in the cup holder where she could smell it if she wanted. She drove. Dante found the note at 4 in the morning and sat in his kitchen until the sky went gray and the city below him began its ordinary noise. Then, for the first time in 30 years of navigating situations where the wrong move cost lives, he picked up a phone and didn't know who to call. Because here was the thing that was just beginning to break open inside his chest as the morning light came through the glass. He had people for everything. He had men who could find anyone in this city within hours, people with resources and connections and skills designed precisely for the problem of a person who did not want to be found. And she had known that. She had always known that. Which meant that if Elena Moretti had left him with nothing but a note, it was because she had planned for exactly that capability. It was because somewhere in the time he had been looking through her, she had been looking back at him with clear eyes and a working mind, and she had built something he hadn't noticed being built. He picked up the note. Read it again. Don't look for me. It wasn't a plea. He sat with the understanding of that for a long time. The specific weight of what it meant that his wife's final instruction to him wasn't desperate or afraid or even angry. It was calm. The confidence of a woman who was already gone before she ever walked out the door. His phone buzzed. It was his brother Marco calling from a number Dante associated with problems. He stared at the screen. Marco never called at this hour, unless something had already begun to break. Dante pressed the button to answer, and the first words Marco said turned the cold morning in his chest into something considerably colder. Marco's voice on the phone had a specific texture that Dante had learned to read over 31 years of being his older brother's problem, and later, his older brother's subordinate. There was the Marco who called to complain. Flat, a little whiny, the voice of a man who believed the world owed him adjustments. There was the Marco who called when he was drinking, loose, Too warm, sentences that ran long and circled back. And then there was this Marco. The one on the phone right now at 4:40 in the morning, clipped, very still underneath the words. The Marco who called when something had already gone wrong, and the only question left was how wrong. "You need to come to the warehouse on Kinsey," Marco said. "Now." "I'm not coming to Kinsey at 5 in the morning." "Dante." A pause. Short, loaded. "Come to Kinsey." He went to Kinsey. The warehouse was one of 4 properties they held under a construction company whose actual construction output was minimal and whose primary function was as a location where certain conversations could be had without the ambient noise of the city's surveillance infrastructure. Dante had used it maybe a dozen times in the past 3 years. It smelled of machine oil and concrete and the particular cold that accumulates in large empty spaces during Chicago winters, regardless of whatever heating system you install. Marco was already there when Dante arrived. So was a man named Sal Ricci, who handled the accounting structures for the 3 largest of Dante's financial channels. Sal was 62 years old, had a daughter at Northwestern, wore the same type of gray sweater every time Dante saw him, and was, under ordinary circumstances, the most composed human being in any room he occupied. Sal did not look composed. He was standing near the far wall with his hands in his sweater pockets, and his face arranged in the expression of a man who has been sitting with terrible information long enough that the shock has burned off and left only the residue of it, a kind of gray, exhausted dread. "Sal," Dante said. "There are subpoenas," Sal said. "Federal. They went out yesterday, to 3 of the shell accounts and to the holding company in Delaware." The cold in the warehouse settled into a more specific cold. "Which accounts?" Dante said. It wasn't a question about which accounts. It was buying 6 seconds to let his mind run the geometry of what federal subpoenas touching those structures actually meant. "The Carver Group, the Aldine Trust, and the secondary LLC under Whitmore Holdings," Marco said from behind Dante. "Those 3 together cover almost everything. I know what they cover. Do you?" Marco's voice had an edge on it that Dante registered without turning around. "Because those 3 accounts together, someone put together a map. You don't get to those 3 specific entities by accident. You don't stumble into that combination. Someone who knew the structure told them where to look." The silence in the warehouse was very complete. Dante turned around slowly. Marco was standing with his arms crossed, jaw set, eyes holding something that was trying to be accusation and kept brushing up against fear instead. "Say what you're saying," Dante told him. "I'm saying someone gave them a roadmap." "I heard you. Say the rest of it." Marco's jaw worked. "The subpoenas went out the same day Elena left." Dante looked at his brother for a long time. Long enough that Sal found something very interesting to look at on the concrete floor and very carefully removed himself from the center of the room. "Watch your next sentence," Dante said. His voice was quiet. The particular quiet that people who knew him well understood was not calm. "I'm not accusing her of anything that isn't obvious," Marco said, and his voice was doing something now. Not loud, but pressurized, like steam with nowhere to go. "I'm telling you what the timing means. I'm telling you we have a problem that is connected to whatever is happening in your marriage, and you need to think about that with your head and not with—" "Finish that sentence." Marco stopped. They stood 6 feet apart in a cold warehouse at 5 in the morning, 2 brothers, and the specific architecture of everything between them, 30 years of it, the loyalty and the resentment and the debt in both directions, pressed into the space between them like a physical thing. "The timing could be coincidence," Dante said finally. "It's not coincidence. You don't know that." "Dante!" Marco uncrossed his arms. When he dropped the anger, what was underneath it was worse. It was genuine fear, which Marco almost never showed, which meant the situation was worse than the subpoenas alone indicated. "I've been watching this organization for 15 years. Subpoenas don't land on 3 specific accounts in one day because someone's been clever. They land because someone handed over the architecture, someone with access." Dante said nothing. "She had access," Marco said. "You know she had access. You left documents. That's enough. You left documents in the—" "I said that's enough." The echo of it went up into the rafters. Sal had fully retreated to the far end of the building. Marco stood his ground, but something in his posture absorbed the force of Dante's voice the way a man absorbs a punch he saw coming, braced, diminished, still standing. Dante turned away, walked to the nearest wall, put one hand flat against the concrete, and stood there breathing, which was something he almost never did in front of anyone. Visibly breathe through something, visibly need the seconds. He stayed that way for long enough that Marco stopped waiting for him to speak and simply waited. "Get Carver on the phone," Dante said finally, meaning their attorney. Not his office, his personal line. "It's 5 in the morning. I'm aware of what time it is." "What do you want me to tell him?" Dante pushed off the wall and turned around. "Tell him we need to understand the scope before the business day starts. Tell him I need to know if this is civil or criminal. Tell him to find out who signed the subpoenas and which office they came from." Sal, from the far end of the building. "There's something else." Both brothers looked at him. Sal pulled his hands out of his sweater pockets and held a single folded paper. He crossed the room and handed it to Dante without making eye contact, which Sal never did when he was delivering information he'd rather not be delivering. "I found this in the overnight courier package. It arrived after close of business yesterday, addressed to me personally at the accounting office." Dante unfolded it. It was a photocopy of an internal transfer document, one of the most sensitive documents in the entire structure of his financial architecture, something that not only confirmed the existence of the Aldine Trust, but contained account numbers and a chain of transactions that connected the trust to 3 different sources of revenue that were categorically not legitimate. Documents that should have existed in exactly 2 places: Sal's private files in a single physical folder in Dante's home office safe. Someone had photographed it. The photocopy showed the edge of a phone in the corner, a small sliver of black casing, barely visible, the kind of artifact you get when you're photographing a document quickly and don't notice the angle. At the bottom of the photocopy, in handwriting he recognized immediately and had been looking at all night on a note left on a kitchen counter, were 4 words: "This is my exit." He drove home alone. Didn't want Marco in the car. Didn't want to hear anything else from anyone until he had processed what was inside his chest, which was complicated and ugly and did not resolve into any single emotion, but sat there instead as a kind of static, loud, directionless, filling everything. He kept the car in the parking structure beneath the building for a long time before going up. Sat in the dark with the engine off and his hands on the wheel. The kind of thing he hadn't done since he was 26 years old and had just made a decision that couldn't be undone and needed the space of a car in a dark structure to absorb the reality of it. She had photographed the documents. She had done it methodically, over time, with the specific patience of someone who had no intention of using the information except as armor. "This is my exit. Not, I'm going to destroy you. Not, you'll regret this." She wasn't threatening him. She was explaining herself. She was telling him, with the same composed directness of the note on the kitchen counter, exactly what she had done and exactly why. He thought about the 5 months before she left. Tried to run it backward. Every dinner, every event, every ordinary night in the penthouse, and look for the seams, the moments where she might have been documenting instead of simply being present, the moments where what he had interpreted as quiet compliance was actually something else entirely. He couldn't find them. That was the part that sat worst. He had spent 30 years learning to read rooms, read people, read the spaces between what people said and what they meant. And Elena had been inside his house, inside his life, inside his peripheral vision every day for 14 years. And she had moved through 5 months of the most deliberate and consequential preparation of her life without leaving a visible trace. He had looked through her so completely that he had made himself blind. He went upstairs, stood in the kitchen again. The note was still on the counter where he'd left it. He didn't pick it up. He looked at the bare walls where her paintings had been, and this time, instead of the specific cold of a man confronting an absence, he felt something else, something he didn't have an immediate name for that lived somewhere between recognition and shame and a very particular kind of fury that wasn't directed outward. He picked up his phone and called a number he hadn't called in 6 weeks, because the last time he'd been in that part of his life, he had told himself there was no reason to call more frequently, no reason to need anything at intervals closer than 6 weeks, which was itself a kind of lie. He'd been maintaining so smoothly he had stopped noticing it was a lie. Isabella answered on the third ring, voice already arranged into something warm and practiced. Dante, I need you to listen to me, he said. I'm going to say this once. A pause. Okay? We're done. Another pause, longer. He could hear the texture of it change. What does that? It means what it means. It's done. There'll be an amount transferred to your account by end of week. I'll have someone handle the specifics. I don't want you to call this number again. Dante. Her voice had dropped the warmth like a coat. What was under it was cooler and more angular. You don't get to just... I do, he said. I'm sorry. That's all I have. He ended the call, set the phone face down on the counter, pressed both hands flat on the cold marble surface, and stood there not moving for a long time. In the empty kitchen, in the apartment his wife had left in the night, surrounded by the ghost shapes on the walls where her work used to live. Marco came to the penthouse at 9 that morning without calling. He used his key, a key that Dante had given him 4 years ago for emergency purposes, and that Marco had used twice before, both times involving situations that could legitimately be described as emergencies. He came in and found Dante at the kitchen island with coffee and the look of a man who had been awake all night processing information that had not gotten easier with time. Marco sat across from him, didn't take off his coat. Carver called, Marco said. I know. I talked to him. Then you know it's criminal. Dante looked at his coffee cup. Federal criminal investigation, Marco continued. The subpoenas are from the Chicago field office. This isn't a civil asset thing, Dante. This is DOJ. I know what it is. Then you need to understand. I understand exactly what it is. He looked up. I've understood what this could eventually be for 15 years. I structured everything specifically to create time and distance in the event of... She took the distance away, Marco said. Flat. Not angry now, just stating it. Whatever distance we had in the structure, she collapsed it. Whoever she gave it to, they went straight to the load-bearing pieces. It's like someone handed them the architectural drawings. She didn't give it to them to destroy the organization. Marco stared at him. Dante, they have the Aldine Trust documents. They have the transfer chain. What exactly do you think she did it to make sure no one came after her? He said it quietly, but the words had a particular weight. She didn't do it for money. She didn't do it for revenge. She did it because she needed to be unreachable. She needed us too busy looking at ourselves to bother looking for her. Marco was quiet for a moment. That's a very generous reading of a woman who just handed federal investigators your financial spine, he said. It's an accurate reading. You didn't know her. And apparently neither did you. The kitchen held the silence between them. Outside, the city moved through its mourning. Traffic noise from 42 floors below, thin and distant, like weather in another country. Marco said, more carefully, the partners are going to hear about the subpoenas by end of day. At the latest, tomorrow morning. When that happens, they'll start moving their exposure. They'll run, Marco said. Perkowski already called me this morning. He heard something, I don't know what, but he was asking questions in that way he asks. He asks questions when he's deciding whether to stay on a boat. What did you tell him? I told him nothing was confirmed, but Dante... Marco leaned forward, both elbows on the counter. The posture of a man trying to stay in a conversation that he can see already ending badly. We need to talk about what we do. Not what Elena did, not why she did it, not the... He gestured vaguely in the direction of the bare walls, all of that. We need to talk about the organization and what the next 30 days look like. Dante set down his coffee cup. The next 30 days. At minimum. You want to talk about the next 30 days? He stood up from the bar stool slowly, walked to the window. The city spread out in every direction, ordinary and enormous, indifferent. Marco, who are we protecting? What? The organization, the empire, the... He stopped, put one hand on the glass. What is it exactly that we're protecting? Name it. Marco looked at him with an expression that was equal parts confusion and the specific suspicion of a man watching his older brother do something unfamiliar. We're protecting... I built this thing, Dante said, quietly, to the window. 30 years. Before you came in, before any of it was what it became. I built it and I protected it, and I made every decision in service of building it bigger and more protected. And somewhere in that 30 years, I looked at my wife and stopped seeing a person and started seeing what? A fixture. Something that was there when I came home. Something I didn't need to look at directly because it was already accounted for. Dante, now's not the time to... She planned for 5 months. 5 months of living with me, sleeping under the same roof, going to my events, sitting at my table, and I didn't notice anything. He turned from the window. What does that tell you about the kind of attention I've been paying? Marco had no answer for that. He sat very still, which was not something Marco did naturally. Get Carver to set up a meeting, Dante said. A real one. I want to understand the actual scope of what they have before I decide anything. And if the scope is what I think it is? Dante picked up his coffee, finished it, set the cup down. Then we'll have a different conversation. About what? About what's worth protecting, Dante said. And what isn't. Marco left 20 minutes later without the clarity he'd come for, which Dante understood and didn't particularly care about. After the elevator doors closed, he walked through the penthouse again, slowly, the way he had walked through it at 4 in the morning, but with better light now and a different quality of attention. He went into the room that had briefly been her studio before it became a storage room. He stood in the doorway. The stored items were still there. Boxes of things neither of them had ever decided on. Under a stack of flattened cardboard, he found, almost accidentally, an old canvas. Small. Maybe 12 by 15 inches. She must have missed it. He picked it up. A painting of a window. The light coming through it in a particular way. Morning light, the specific quality of early morning light that has a physical weight to it. Simple. Technically perfect in a way that communicated absolutely how much ability she had simply not used for 14 years while she was running his household and attending his events and learning to be invisible inside her own marriage. He held the painting in both hands and looked at it for a long time. Then he put it on his kitchen counter, leaning against the backsplash, where the bare wall faced it. And he went to find his phone because his attorney had called twice while he was standing in that room, and because the machinery of the disaster his wife had quietly set in motion was already running, and the question of whether he could stop it was rapidly being replaced by the different and considerably harder question of whether he should. It was at that precise moment, phone in hand, canvas on the counter, the city wide and indifferent outside his glass walls, that Dante Moretti received a second call, not from Carver, not from Marco, from a blocked number that he almost let go to voicemail and didn't, for a reason he couldn't have articulated cleanly if someone had asked him. He answered. The voice on the other end was a woman's, professional, measured, the voice of someone accustomed to delivering information that changes the shape of the room she's in. Mr. Moretti, she said, my name is Special Agent Karen Voss. I'm with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Chicago Field Office. We'd like to schedule a time to speak with you at your earliest convenience. A pause. Brief, practiced. I'd suggest your earliest convenience be today. He stood in his kitchen holding his phone, standing next to a painting of morning light that his wife had made and left behind, in a penthouse that felt, for the first time in 14 years, like nothing he recognized, and he understood with a clarity that required no additional information that the world he had built, every structure, every channel, every carefully maintained inch of empire, had reached the end of the particular road it had always been traveling. The only question remaining was whether Dante Moretti would meet it standing up, or whether he would do what he had always done, find someone else to absorb the impact while he found another road. He hadn't decided yet. But he was, for the first time in a very long time, genuinely unsure which man he was going to turn out to be. He didn't call Agent Voss back immediately. That was deliberate. 30 years in a world where the pace at which you responded to pressure communicated everything about your position. You never answered fast, never let anyone believe their timeline was your timeline. He set the phone down on the counter next to Elena's painting and stood there for 60 seconds, breathing through it, letting the information settle into its proper place in his mind before he let himself react to any of it. Then he called Carver. Thomas Carver had been Dante's attorney for 19 years. He was 67, had a face like weathered limestone, and charged $450 an hour with the specific, unhurried confidence of a man who understood that his client's problems were, ultimately what paid for his house in Lake Forest and his boat in Belmont Harbor. He answered on the first ring, which told Dante that Carver had also been waiting for this particular call. "I heard from Voss," Dante said. "I know. She called my office 20 minutes ago." A pause. Paper moving in the background. Carver always had paper moving, always had three things happening at once in that calm, organized way of his. "Dante, I need you to not say anything to anyone until we've met in person. Not to Marco, not to your associates, not to... I know how this works. I need to hear you say it. I won't talk to anyone, including Voss. I'm not calling Voss back without you in the room." "Good." Another pause. Longer. "There's something I need to tell you before we meet. I received something this morning. Courier. Arrived at the office before I got in. My paralegal called me about it at 7:15. Dante waited. "It was a document package," Carver said. "Substantial. 38 pages of financial documentation, transfer records, account structures, internal communications, the kind of thing that took significant time and access to compile." His voice had taken on the specific, careful flatness of a man constructing each sentence before releasing it. "It was also sent to the FBI field office. I know because there was a cover note indicating simultaneous delivery. Whoever sent it wanted you to know that both parties received it at the same time." The kitchen was very quiet. "The cover note," Dante said. "Was it signed?" A beat. "It was signed with her initials," Carver said. EVM. Elena Vasquez Moretti. The name she had technically kept through 14 years of marriage, maintained in certain legal contexts because she had explained once, early on, that she wasn't ready to lose the Vasquez part entirely, and he had said fine without particularly thinking about what it meant to her, and then had forgotten about it completely within a week. He stood in the kitchen for a moment without speaking. "Dante, I'm here. Come to the office, not the main office, the River North space. Come alone, use the parking structure on Superior, come up through the back, don't use your regular car." A pause. "How soon can you be there?" "An hour. Make it 45 minutes. He ended the call, stood very still. Then he picked up Elena's painting from the counter and carried it to the spare room and leaned it carefully against the wall, face inward. He didn't examine why he did that. He just did it, and then he went to get his coat. The River North office was technically a consulting firm that Carver maintained for client meetings that required discretion beyond what his standard LaSalle Street address provided. It occupied the top floor of a narrow 6-story building between a restaurant supply company and an architecture firm, accessed through a back stairwell that smelled of old carpet and industrial cleaning solution. Dante had been here 4 times in 19 years. Each time marked an occasion when the ordinary channels weren't sufficient. Carver was already there. So was a woman Dante didn't recognize. Late 40s, dark suit, reading glasses pushed up on her head. The kind of stillness that read as legal rather than law enforcement. She was sitting at the far end of a table with a legal pad in front of her, and the look of someone who had reviewed the document package and reached conclusions that she was now organizing into their order of importance. "This is Diana Marsh," Carver said. "She's a federal criminal defense specialist. I asked her to come in this morning." Dante looked at Carver. "Sit down," Carver said. Not unkindly. Dante sat. Diana Marsh opened the legal pad to the first page of her notes. She had small, precise handwriting, the kind that covers a lot of ground without wasting space. "Mr. Moretti, I've spent the last 90 minutes reviewing the documentation your wife provided to federal investigators. I want to walk you through what they have, because I think there's a significant gap between what you believe they can prove and what they can actually prove." "How bad?" Dante said. She looked at him steadily. "The Aldine Trust documentation alone establishes a pattern of structured transactions over an 11-year period that carries a mandatory minimum of 12 years under federal sentencing guidelines. The transfer chain connecting Aldine to the Whitmore LLC introduces a secondary conspiracy charge. The internal communications..." She paused, turned a page. "And I want you to prepare yourself for this part, Mr. Moretti, because the internal communications are the part that makes the financial documentation significantly worse." "What internal communications?" Carver said, carefully. The communications between you and 3 of your business partners over the past 7 years. Text-based. Routed through the encrypted messaging system your organization used. That system was compromised, Diana Marsh said, simply, without inflection. Approximately 8 months ago. We believe by one of your own people, though identifying which one is currently secondary to the problem of what the communications contain. Dante went very still. He had used that messaging system for 7 years. Had believed it to be based on the assurances of the man who built it for him, a former intelligence contractor named Hess, who charged an extraordinary amount for the service, and who Dante had trusted on the recommendation of 2 people he trusted absolutely. Impenetrable. Had conducted, through that system, the kind of conversations that existed nowhere else, the kind that connected financial movement to specific decisions, the kind that would, if read by the right eyes in the right sequence, constitute not just evidence of financial crime, but evidence of the human decisions behind it. How much, he said. His voice came out level. He was proud of that, in a distant, observational way. Approximately 4 years of communication, Diana Marsh said. Selected. Whoever compiled the package for the FBI was not indiscriminate. They chose specifically. The selections demonstrate pattern, intent, and decision-making authority. They are not communications that can be explained as the ordinary conduct of a legitimate business. The silence in the room had a specific density. Who compiled it? Dante said. The communications. Elena didn't have access to Hess's system. Carver and Diana Marsh exchanged a look that lasted approximately 1 second, but contained a full conversation. No, Carver said. She didn't. Dante looked between them. The financial documentation was Elena's contribution, Diana Marsh said. The communications were compiled by someone else and submitted to the FBI separately, but timed to arrive simultaneously with your wife's package. Coordinated delivery, 2 separate sources, combined into a single evidentiary package. Someone else, Dante said. We don't know who yet. What we know is that whoever it was had prolonged authorized access to the messaging system. That narrows it considerably. Dante pushed back from the table and stood up, walked to the window. The street below was ordinary. A delivery truck double-parked, 2 people at a crosswalk, a woman walking a dog. The unaware world continuing its unaware business. Hess, Dante said. Silence behind him. He turned around. It was Hess. Carver's face confirmed it without moving. How long have you known? Dante said. I received information this morning that suggested... How long? Carver took off his glasses and set them on the table. He was 67 years old and had maintained a very particular professional composure for the entire 19 years of their relationship. And what was on his face right now was not composure. It was the look of a man who was about to say something that would permanently alter the nature of a relationship and who had made his peace with that necessity. 3 days, Carver said. The word landed in the room and sat there. 3 days, Dante repeated. I received information 3 days ago that suggested Hess had been in contact with federal investigators. I didn't have confirmation. I didn't want to bring you something unconfirmed that would... You didn't want to bring me something unconfirmed. Dante's voice was very quiet. The specific quiet. My communications are being handed to the FBI and you sat on intelligence about it for 3 days. Dante, who told you? That's not... Who told you, Thomas? Carver held his gaze. Marco. The air in the room changed. Diana Marsh had gone very still. She was the kind of professional who understood that there were moments in client meetings when the correct posture was absolute stillness and absolute silence, and she had recognized this as one of those moments approximately 4 seconds ago. Dante stood at the window and looked at his attorney of 19 years and processed the specific geometry of what he'd just been handed. Marco had known about Hess 3 days ago. Marco had told Carver, not Dante. Marco, who had been in the warehouse on Kinsey this morning performing the role of a man receiving devastating news for the first time, face arranged in the right configuration of shock and urgency and fraternal concern. Marco, who had been managing the relationship with Hess for the past 2 years because Dante had delegated it, the way he delegated things he trusted people to handle. The room was very quiet for a long time. Get out, Dante said to Carver. Dante, I understand you're... Get out of the room, both of you. Give me 5 minutes. They went. The door closed. Dante stood at the window alone and breathed through it. Not quickly, not with any visible drama, just stood there and breathed and let the full shape of it assemble itself in his mind without flinching away from any part. Hess had been flipped. How long ago was a question, but the messaging access meant at minimum months, possibly longer. The FBI had 4 years of selected communications, selected by someone who knew the architecture well enough to extract precisely the material that was most damaging, which meant Hess hadn't simply opened a door and let investigators walk through. Hess had been a collaborator, active, intelligent, motivated by something: money, protection, his own legal exposure, all three. And Marco had known about it for 3 days and had said nothing. The question was whether Marco had known longer. The question under that question was whether Marco had made his own arrangements. The question under that question was whether the brother who had sat across from him at the kitchen counter this morning with genuine fear on his face, and Dante had read that fear as real, had staked 30 years of reading people on it being real, was a man in the process of being caught in a betrayal, or a man who had already completed one and was managing the aftermath. He called Marco. It rang 4 times, then went to voicemail. He called again. Voicemail. He put the phone in his pocket, walked to the door, opened it. Carver and Diana Marsh were standing in the small hallway in the posture of people waiting outside a hospital room. Carver looked at him with something that was trying to be professional neutrality and not quite getting there. "Bring them both in," Dante said. "I want to meet with Voss today, with you and Marsh in the room." Carver blinked. "Dante?" "A meeting with federal investigators at this stage without first, not to talk, to listen." He looked at Carver steadily. "I want to know the exact scope of what they have before I make any decision. I'm done operating on incomplete information." A pause. "It seems to be a pattern I've been living with for a while without noticing." Marco came to the River North office at noon. He came because Dante sent a 3-word text: River North. Now. And the specificity of the location meant Marco understood that whatever had been in the morning, this was something different. He came in from the back stairwell the same way Dante had, coat still on, and he came into the room and looked at the table where Dante was sitting alone with 2 empty coffee cups and the legal pad Diana Marsh had left behind. And whatever Marco had been planning to say when he walked through the door, he didn't say it. He sat down across from Dante without being asked. They looked at each other. "Hess," Dante said. Marco said nothing. "How long did you know?" Marco put both hands flat on the table. He was 54 years old, and he had spent his adult life moving in the shadow of his older brother's reputation and capability and the specific, exhausting weight of being the person who came second in every room they both occupied. And he had managed this with a kind of compressed dignity that Dante had always respected without examining too closely. He looked at his hands now, not at Dante. 6 months, Marco said. The number hit the room like a door slamming. 6 months. Dante's voice didn't rise. "You knew Hess was talking to federal investigators for 6 months." "I didn't know for certain until 6 months, Marco." Marco looked up. His jaw was set. His eyes were doing something complicated. Not guilt, exactly, or not only guilt. Something else. Something that had been living behind his composed exterior for a long time and had finally run out of room. "Yes," he said. 6 months. "And you didn't tell me." "No." "Why?" Marco was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had the specific flatness of a man who has decided that he's finished performing. "Because 6 months ago I went to Hess myself when I started to suspect, and Hess told me what he was doing and why, and I made a decision." The room became a different kind of quiet. "What decision?" Dante said. "I made a deal," Marco said, "with the same investigators Hess was working with. I gave them—" He stopped, took a breath. Not dramatic, just necessary. "I gave them context, background, things that helped them understand the structure, things that corroborated what Hess was providing." Dante looked at his brother. He looked at him the way you look at something when you're not sure if your eyes are functioning correctly. The specific suspended attention of a person waiting for the information to rearrange itself into something that makes more sense than what it currently appears to be. It did not rearrange. "You made a deal," Dante said. "I made a deal." Marco met his eyes. "I have a daughter. She's 19 years old. She doesn't know what her father does for a living, which means she doesn't know what her uncle does either, which means she's been living in a world I built for her that is held up by things that will eventually fall, regardless of what either of us does. I made a decision about what I wanted to still be standing when it falls. Dante said nothing. I didn't plan it as a betrayal, Marco said. I planned it as an exit. I planned it the same way Elena planned hers. Actually, methodically, without telling you, because telling you would have made it impossible. His voice was steady. The voice of a man who has rehearsed this conversation in his mind many times, in many forms, and is now simply saying the words that have been waiting. She was trying to save her life. I was trying to save my daughters. I can understand if that distinction doesn't mean anything to you right now. What is the deal? Dante said, flatly. Specifically, what did you give them? Corroborating testimony on the Carver Group structure. A chain of decisions over a 4-year period. My own involvement is on the table. I'm not walking away clean, Dante. I'm not telling myself that story, but my cooperation means I'm not looking at the same exposure you are. And what am I looking at? Marco looked at him across the table. The 2 empty coffee cups between them. The legal pad. The bare functional room that existed for exactly these kinds of conversations and had never hosted one this specific before. Without cooperation, Marco said, the U.S. Attorney's Office believes they can make a case that puts you away for 20 to 25 years. A pause. With cooperation, real cooperation, not managed, not partial, they've indicated they'd consider significantly reduced exposure, potentially as low as 4 to 6 years, with the possibility of reduction for full dismantlement of the financial architecture. Dante absorbed this. They asked me, Marco said quietly, to deliver this information to you in person, because they believe, given everything that's happened in the last 24 hours, that you might be, he paused, searching for the right word, reachable, in a way you might not have been before. The afternoon light was coming through the room's single window at a low angle, the particular flat light of a Chicago winter afternoon that illuminates without warming. Dante sat in it and looked at his brother and thought about 30 years, the architecture of 30 years, the decisions and the costs and the people and the things he'd told himself were necessary and the things he'd told himself he'd deal with later, and the woman who had stood beside him for 14 of those years and watched him with eyes he'd never bothered to look into directly. 20 to 25 years, Dante said, without cooperation. And Elena, Marco frowned slightly. What about her? Her cooperation, her documentation, she's already given them what she gave them. Is there any exposure for her, any legal? She's protected, Marco said, completely. Whatever arrangement she made through her attorney was structured with immunity from the beginning. She's not a target. She was never going to be a target. He paused. She was the one who opened the door. They don't prosecute the people who open the doors. Dante nodded slowly. Something settled in his face. Not relief, not defeat, but the specific expression of a man who has received news that is devastating and also, in some way, he can't yet fully articulate, correct. The way a diagnosis can be devastating and correct at the same time. I need, he said, and then stopped. Tried again. I need you to set up the meeting with Voss, not through Carver, directly through your contact in the field office. Marco looked at him carefully. What are you going to do? I'm going to sit across from a federal agent and tell the truth, Dante said, for probably the first time in 30 years in any official context. He pushed back from the table, stood, looked at Marco with an expression that contained no warmth and no coldness, simply a kind of exhausted clarity. I'm going to need you to leave first. I need 5 minutes in this room by myself. Marco stood, put his coat back on. He moved toward the door and stopped with his hand on the frame and looked back. For what it's worth, Marco said. Don't, Dante said. Marco nodded once and left. Dante stood alone in the room for 5 minutes, as promised. He stood at the window and looked at the ordinary street below. And he thought about Elena in Harrow Bay. Wherever that was, whatever it looked like, whatever she was doing in the apartment she'd rented in cash from a retired schoolteacher who asked no questions. He thought about her driving away from Chicago in a car he didn't know existed, in the gray early morning, with a suitcase and her mother's perfume and 14 years behind her and nothing in front of her except whatever she decided to build. She had planned her exit for 5 months. He realized, approximately 48 hours to plan his. The difference was that she had known exactly who she was building toward. He was standing in a room in River North in the flat winter light with 30 years of empire in the process of becoming evidence. And the only thing he knew for certain about the man he was going to have to become was that he bore very little resemblance to the man who had stepped out of an elevator at 4 in the morning and found a note on a kitchen counter and felt, for the first time in decades, the specific terror of something that could not be controlled. He picked up his phone, pulled up the contact for Agent Karen Voss, looked at the number for a long moment. Then he pressed call, and while it rang, he put his left hand flat against the cold glass of the window and felt the winter pressing back from the other side. And he did not look away from the street below. And when she answered, he said his name and said he'd like to meet at her earliest convenience. And she said she could make this afternoon work. And he said that was fine. And the word fine hung in the air of the empty room like something that had never been less true and had never been more necessary. Outside, 4 stories below, a woman was walking a dog in the thin winter light, and the dog stopped to investigate something invisible at the base of a lamppost. And the woman waited with the particular patient stillness of someone who has learned to let things take the time they need. And Dante watched them until they moved on. And then he put on his coat and went to meet the consequence of everything he'd built. The FBI field office on West Roosevelt Road was not what people imagined when they imagined federal buildings. It wasn't imposing. It wasn't designed to communicate power through architecture the way courthouses were. No columns, no stone, no deliberate grandeur meant to remind you of the distance between yourself and the institution. It was a building that communicated something more unsettling than power. It communicated bureaucratic permanence, the specific, airless endurance of a place that has processed thousands of people in various states of ruin and will process thousands more and will not be particularly altered by any of them. Dante came in through the front entrance at 2:40 in the afternoon with Thomas Carver on his left and Diana Marsh on his right. And the lobby guard processed his ID with the flat efficiency of a man who had seen every variety of person walk through those doors and had long since stopped assigning meaning to any of them. They went through security. They were escorted to a conference room on the 4th floor. The room had a table, 8 chairs, a whiteboard with nothing on it, and a window that faced the interior of the building. No view, just another wall of glass and offices. A room designed to contain a conversation without giving anyone anything else to look at. Agent Karen Voss was already in the room. She was 51, dark hair going gray at the temples in a way she hadn't attempted to address, wearing a charcoal blazer over a plain white shirt. She had the physical economy of movement that came from a career spent in rooms like this one. Nothing wasted, nothing performed, the stillness of someone who understood that the most effective tool in any interrogation was simply being less visibly anxious than the person across the table. Beside her was a man introduced as Assistant U.S. Attorney David Kwan, late 40s, Korean-American, a face that communicated precisely nothing about what he was thinking, which Dante recognized as an acquired professional skill and therefore respected. They shook hands. They sat down. Carver placed a single folder on the table in front of him and left it closed. Diana Marsh had a legal pad. Dante had nothing in front of him which was deliberate. He wanted nothing between himself and whoever was speaking. Voss said, "Mr. Moretti, thank you for coming in." "I don't need the courtesy," Dante said. "Let's talk about what you have." Voss looked at him for a moment. A slight recalibration. She had walked in expecting a particular variety of man, and the man across the table was presenting as something she hadn't entirely accounted for. She moved forward. "All right, what we have is extensive. I think you're aware of that. Walk me through it." Kwan opened the folder in front of him. He had the physical manner of a man who had prosecuted complex financial cases for 20 years and understood that the most effective presentation was not theatrical. It was sequential, it was precise, and it was delivered with the calm confidence of someone who has already done the work and simply needs to communicate the results. He walked them through it. It took 40 minutes. Dante listened to all of it without interrupting, which appeared to be something Voss had not expected. She watched him with the peripheral attention of a person monitoring for the specific tells of a subject beginning to fracture under the weight of what they're hearing. He didn't fracture. He sat and listened, and occasionally his jaw tightened, and occasionally he looked at a specific document that Quan slid across the table with the focused attention of a man reading a contract, not a man reading a case being built against him. When Quan finished, the room was quiet for a moment. "The communications," Dante said. "The messaging system. How many of my conversations did Hess provide?" "Comprehensively," Voss said. 4 years, 2 months. "How many of those conversations are you using?" Quan said, "Enough." "I'm asking for a number." Quan looked at Voss. A communication passed between them, the shorthand of two people who have discussed the parameters of exactly this question before this meeting began. Quan said, 31 specific exchanges. Those 31 alone, without anything else in the package, constitute a prosecutable case. Carver said carefully, "My client has indicated a willingness to discuss the parameters of cooperation." "Your client can speak for himself," Dante said. Carver closed his mouth. Dante looked at Voss directly. "What does full cooperation look like? In your definition, not a managed version. Full." Voss held his gaze. "Full cooperation means a complete and accurate accounting of the organization's financial architecture going back to its inception. It means identifying every entity, every account, every shell structure, every channel. It means identifying every individual who participated in a decision-making capacity. It means providing testimony, if we need it, regarding specific transactions and specific conversations." She paused. "It means actively assisting in the dismantlement of every operational structure that hasn't already been reached by the existing investigation. Beat soski itasam sit. And in return, we would recommend to the court a sentence in the range of 4 to 7 years, with eligibility for reduction based on the quality and completeness of cooperation. No asset forfeiture beyond what's directly connected to criminal proceeds. Your legitimate holdings, the restaurant group, the property management company on the North Shore, remain intact." She paused again, a calculated pause. "And complete immunity for your wife." "She already has immunity," Dante said. "She has the immunity we extended as part of her cooperation in the initial documentation phase," Voss said. "What I'm offering now is something broader. Something that insulates her from any future exposure that might arise as the investigation develops. A guarantee." She let that word sit on the table. "We're offering it because we believe it matters to you, and because we want you to understand the full scope of what cooperation means in this context." Dante looked at this whiteboard, the empty whiteboard on the wall behind Quan. He looked at it the way a person looks at something neutral when their brain is processing something that has nothing neutral in it. 30 years. Every decision, every structure, every person he had pulled into his orbit and used and in some cases burned and in some cases discarded. All of it reduced to 31 message exchanges and a folder of documents that a woman he hadn't truly looked at in years had assembled in the quiet hours of a marriage he'd been neglecting while he was busy maintaining the empire she was methodically photographing. "I need 24 hours, Dante said. Voss said, "You have until tomorrow morning at 9. He did not go back to the penthouse. He drove, himself, no driver, one of the secondary cars from the garage that Marco didn't know he kept. And he drove without a specific destination for almost an hour, through the late afternoon traffic, down Lake Shore Drive with the lake gray and vast to his right, and the city stacked up to his left. And he let the driving occupy the part of his mind that needed something mechanical to do, while the rest of it worked through what it needed to work through. He ended up at a bar in Bridgeport. Not a bar he'd ever been to, a neighborhood place. Low ceilings, older clientele, a television in the corner showing afternoon sports with the sound turned down. He sat at the far end of the bar and ordered whiskey and drank it slowly, and did not look at his phone for 40 minutes. He thought about the 31 conversations, tried to identify them, to place them, to remember the context of each one. He could identify about 20 by probable content. The other 11 were opaque, which was its own specific discomfort, not knowing which words of yours have been handed to the people most positioned to use them against you. He thought about Marco's daughter, 19 years old, didn't know what her family did for a living. Marco had built a wall between her and the reality of their world. And then when the wall started showing cracks, Marco had made the only choice available to a man who wants to keep a wall standing. He'd gotten to the other side of it before it fell. Dante couldn't say, sitting in a bar in Bridgeport with a glass of whiskey, that he would have done differently. He ordered a second whiskey. The bartender was a woman in her 60s with no interest in him beyond the transaction, which was exactly what he needed. He thought about Elena. He thought about the November night she'd come home with a headache and found him in the study, and he'd seen something cross her face. He remembered it now. He hadn't understood it then. He'd processed it as upset and had said the things you say and believed that the situation had been managed. He remembered her face with a new specificity that was its own punishment. The absolute stillness of it. The way she'd turned away not in devastation, but in something quieter and more complete. The expression of a person who has just received the last piece of information they needed. He had thought, in the weeks after that night, that things had settled. He had been watching for anger, for withdrawal, for the behavioral signals that the equilibrium of the marriage had been disturbed. He'd seen none of those signals. He'd interpreted the absence of signals as recovery. He had been watching for the wrong things. He had been watching for a woman in pain when he should have been watching for a woman with a plan. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. A text from a number he didn't recognize, 5 words. "We need to talk, tonight." He stared at it, typed back, "Who is this?" The response came in seconds. Hess. The bar continued its quiet afternoon business around him. The television showed someone making a long putt. The woman 2 stools down was reading something on her phone with the focused expression of a person actively not paying attention to anyone else. Dante looked at Hess's name on his screen and understood several things simultaneously. That Hess reaching out directly meant Hess believed he had something to offer that was distinct from what he'd already provided to federal investigators. That Hess contacting him this way, on a number that Hess should not have had access to, meant either Hess had resources Dante had underestimated, or someone had given Hess the number, which was its own category of problem. And that meeting Hess was approximately the worst decision available to him in the next 24 hours, legally speaking, and potentially in other ways as well. He texted back where. The location Hess specified was a parking structure in Pilsen. 3 levels, mostly empty at 7 in the evening, the kind of structure attached to a commercial building whose business day had ended hours ago. Dante came alone, which Carver would have described, if he'd known, as a form of active legal self-destruction. He parked on the 2nd level and sat in the car for 3 minutes and watched the structure's interior through the windshield before he got out. Hess was on foot. He came from the stairwell at the east end of the level, alone, hands visible, wearing a dark coat that had seen better years. He was 58, built narrow, with the specific energy of a man whose entire life had been spent in the cracks between other people's power structures. Useful to everyone, owned by no one. Always positioned slightly sideways to any direct line of accountability. He'd built his business on that positioning. Dante had used that positioning for 7 years, and now he was standing in a parking structure in Pilsen, looking at the man who'd spent those 7 years recording him. They stood 20 feet apart. "You have about 2 minutes to say something worth my time," Dante said. "There's a third party," Hess said. His voice was different than Dante remembered. Thinner, with the particular sound of someone who hasn't been sleeping. "Someone outside your organization who approached me 14 months ago, before the FBI contact. They came first." Dante said nothing. "They wanted the communications," Hess said. "Not for legal purposes, for leverage. Private leverage. They offered me more than the FBI eventually did, and they offered it first. I took the meeting." He paused. "I didn't take the deal. But I took the meeting, which means they know what I know, and they know I was in contact with your system." "Who?" Hess rubbed the side of his jaw, the gesture of a man working up to something. "A man named Cutler. He operates out of New York. He's not organized crime in any traditional sense. He's more of a service provider for people who want leverage without involvement." "I know who Cutler is," Dante said. "Why does he want leverage over me?" "Because of a deal you made in 2019 with a logistics company in Antwerp. The deal involved moving certain cargo through a channel that Cutler believes he owns the right to. He believes you cut him out of something worth approximately $4 million in annual revenue. He's been building a case for leverage for the past 2 years, and he's been using me as one of the people positioned to provide it." Dante felt something move through him that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite recognition. It was closer to the feeling of a man who has been navigating by a map that turns out to have had a deliberate error in it, and who has just found the error. "Cutler was working with the FBI," he said. Not a question. "No," Hess said. "That's the thing. He was working parallel to them. He was building his own package, separate from what I gave the feds, separate from what your wife did. His version was never meant for a courtroom. It was meant to sit in his pocket and be visible to you at a specific moment of his choosing, when your exposure from the federal investigation was maximum and your ability to push back was minimum. He wants a negotiation, Dante said. He wants you to sign over the Antwerp channel and 2 related operations. In exchange, the package he built, the one with communications that the FBI doesn't have, the ones that would add exposure in a whole separate jurisdiction, stays buried. The parking structure was cold and smelled of concrete and exhaust. 2 levels below them, a car entered the structure, headlights sweeping up through the gaps in the floor, throwing moving patterns of light against the ceiling for a moment before the car found a space and went dark. Dante looked at Hess. "You're telling me this," he said, "because—" Hess met his eyes. "Because Cutler told me 2 days ago that if you cooperate with the FBI, the secondary package goes to a different federal office, one where your cooperation agreement isn't in play. He wants you to know that cooperating your way out of the first problem doesn't get you out of the second problem. He wants you at the table with him before you sit down with Voss. And you came to tell me this personally because you want something." Hess was quiet for a moment. Then, "I want out of all of it. I want a letter from your attorney confirming that you're not going to come after me once the federal matter resolves. I want to be done. You want a guarantee from the man you helped build a case against." "I want to be done," Hess said again, the thin voice, the not sleeping quality in it. "I made decisions I can't undo. I'm telling you about Cutler because it's the only useful thing I have left, and because if Cutler wins this, if he gets what he wants by threatening you with secondary exposure, he becomes exactly the kind of problem for your successors that I don't want to be connected to." Dante stared at him. "You're afraid of him," Dante said. Hess said nothing, which was its own answer. Dante walked back toward his car. He stopped with his hand on the door and turned around. "The secondary package," he said, "the communications Cutler has. Do you know what specific exchanges are in it?" Hess nodded slowly. "Does it include conversations involving Marco?" A pause. A very specific pause. "Yes." "Does it include conversations that would directly contradict Marco's cooperation agreement with the FBI?" The pause this time was longer. Hess's face, in the flat light of the parking structure, went through something complicated and arrived at an expression that was almost apologetic, which on Hess's face was one of the stranger things Dante had ever seen. "Yes," Hess said. "It does." Dante got in the car. He sat with his hands on the wheel and the engine off, and the specific weight of what had just happened settling into his chest. Cutler had a package that could expose Marco's cooperation agreement as contradictory, which would negate Marco's deal, which would pull Marco back into maximum exposure, which meant that Marco's 19-year-old daughter, who didn't know what her family did for a living, would be watching her father trade one catastrophe for another. Dante thought about what it would mean to hand Cutler what he wanted, to sign over the Antwerp channel and walk away from the leverage problem and cooperate with Voss from a position where the secondary exposure had been neutralized. It would cost him revenue he could survive losing. It would mean negotiating with a man he held in contempt. It would mean admitting in the most concrete possible way that someone had outmaneuvered him at his own game. He thought about what it would mean to refuse Cutler, to go into the cooperation agreement with Voss knowing that Cutler's package was sitting in reserve, waiting for the moment of maximum legal vulnerability. To watch Cutler deploy it and watch Marco's deal collapse and watch his brother, the brother who had betrayed him for a reason Dante had spent the afternoon deciding he understood, even if he couldn't forgive, take the full weight of it. He turned the key. The engine came on. He sat in the parking structure with the engine running for a moment, looking at the concrete wall in front of him, and he understood that he was sitting at the intersection of 2 decisions and that both of them would cost him something he couldn't get back. He pulled out of the space and drove toward the exit, and by the time he reached the street level, he had made the decision, and it was not the decision the man he had been 2 days ago would have made. And the newness of that, the unfamiliarity of being someone who made this particular variety of choice, sat in his chest like something raw and necessary and not at all comfortable. He drove back through Pilsen with the windows down despite the cold because he needed air, because the inside of the car felt suddenly insufficient for the size of what he was carrying. And he drove past the neighborhood where Elena had grown up without knowing that's what he was doing until he saw the street sign and realized where his memory had navigated him. And he didn't stop, but he slowed for a moment and looked at the ordinary blocks, the 3 flats and the corner stores and the late evening street life of a neighborhood that had always known how to continue regardless of what happened around it. And then he accelerated and drove on toward whatever morning was coming, which was not going to be gentle and was not going to be easy and was, for the first time in 30 years of building things designed to keep the consequences away from his door, entirely and inescapably his. His phone lit up on the passenger seat, a calendar alert he'd set himself weeks ago for a reason he couldn't remember. He glanced at it at a red light and saw the note he'd written himself in whatever ordinary moment he'd created this reminder. Elena's gallery application deadline, Harrow Bay Arts Council. He had no memory of putting that in his calendar. No memory of knowing about it. No memory of caring enough to note it. But it was there, in his own handwriting via his own phone, which meant that somewhere in the years of not looking, some part of him had been paying attention without telling the rest of him about it. The light changed. He drove. He called Cutler at 10 o'clock that night, not to negotiate, to listen. Because 30 years of operating in a world where information was currency had taught him that the most important thing you could do before a confrontation was understand exactly what the other person believed they were holding. Let them feel the weight of it. Let them hear themselves say it out loud. Because people who hold leverage almost always overestimate it. And in the gap between what they believe they have and what they actually have is where every real decision gets made. Cutler answered on the second ring. His voice was New York in the specific way that meant money. Flat, efficient, the accent of a man who had grown up with less and had spent 2 decades sanding the rough edges off everything except his ambition. He was 60, ran a private equity operation that was legitimate on its surface and considerably more textured underneath. And he had the particular confidence of someone who had never personally experienced the consequences of his own decisions, because he had always been careful to ensure that consequences landed on people further down the chain. "Moretti," Cutler said, "I was expecting your call." "Then you've been expecting the wrong thing," Dante said. "I'm not calling about the Antwerp channel." A brief pause. "No? I'm calling to tell you that the package you're holding is going to the FBI tomorrow morning. Not from me, from a source inside your own operation that you've underestimated. And when it goes, it's going with a full accounting of how it was compiled and who authorized the compilation, which puts you in a position that I think you'd rather avoid." He didn't have a source inside Cutler's operation. What he had was Hess, who had taken a meeting with Cutler 14 months ago and had therefore seen enough of how Cutler operated to make this statement plausible. And what he had was the specific knowledge that men like Cutler, men who operated in the space between legitimate and criminal without ever fully committing to either side, were most vulnerable not to direct confrontation, but to the suggestion that their exposure was already in motion. You couldn't stop something that had already started. And the terror of that, of a process already underway, was more immobilizing than any threat. The silence on the line lasted 6 full seconds. Dante counted them. "That's a bluff," Cutler said. "It might be," Dante said. "You have until 8 tomorrow morning to decide how sure you are." He ended the call, set the phone on the kitchen counter. He was back in the penthouse, had come back because there was nowhere else to be, because the empty apartment was at least honest about what it was. He stood in the kitchen for a moment, in the room with the ghost shapes on the walls, and then he went to the spare room and took Elena's painting from where he'd leaned it face inward against the wall and carried it back to the kitchen and set it on the counter again, facing out. He sat with it for a long time. At 2 in the morning, his phone buzzed, a text from Cutler's number. 4 words. "The channel isn't worth it." Dante read it once, set the phone face down, went to bed for the first time in 36 hours, and slept the flat, dreamless sleep of a man whose body has simply stopped negotiating. He was in Carver's office at 8:15 the next morning. Carver looked like a man who had also not slept well, which Dante noted without particular sympathy. Diana Marsh was there. Between them on the conference table was a cooperation agreement that Marsh had drafted through the night. 43 pages, dense and precise, the legal architecture of a man dismantling everything he'd spent 30 years building. Dante read all 43 pages. This took 90 minutes. Carver and Marsh sat across from him and let him read without interrupting, which was the correct instinct. At one point, he stopped at a specific paragraph, Section 14, subsection C, the portion dealing with the identification of business partners. And he read it 3 times, and then he looked up at Marsh. "Marco," he said, "your brother's cooperation agreement with the Chicago field office is separate from this document," Marsh said carefully. "The 2 agreements are parallel. They don't reference each other. But they're compatible. They are structured to be compatible, yes. Who structured them to be compatible?" Marsh and Carver exchanged the look. "Diana was brought in by Carver," Marsh said. "Carver was retained by you. But the compatibility of the 2 agreements was encouraged by the U.S. Attorney's Office, because compatible cooperation from 2 principals is significantly more useful than competing narratives. And Agent Voss knew, when she offered me the enhanced immunity for Elena, that Marco's agreement was already in place." Yes, Dante sat with that. The specific craftsmanship of it, the way the whole situation had been constructed, the sequencing of who knew what and when, the way Voss had walked into that conference room yesterday, already holding both halves of the cooperation structure, and had presented it to him as an offer when it was in fact the final step of something that had been in motion for months. He wasn't angry about it. That was the thing that would have surprised the version of himself from 2 weeks ago. He recognized the craftsmanship and felt something closer to professional acknowledgement than outrage. He signed the agreement. He signed it with the specific deliberateness of a man who has made a decision and intends for the signing to be the thing that makes it real. Not tentative, not hurried. The full signature the way he signed his name when it mattered. Carver witnessed it. Marsh countersigned. And then Dante Moretti sat back in the leather chair in his attorney's conference room and felt the specific sensation of a man who has just handed over the keys to everything he built, which was not relief and was not grief and was not quite either of those things, but lived in the vicinity of both, a kind of vast, complicated quiet. The cooperation process took 11 months. He appeared for 17 separate sessions with the U.S. Attorney's Office, each one lasting between 3 and 8 hours. He provided account numbers, transfer chains, shell company structures, the identities of partners he had protected for decades. He sat across from David Kwan and answered every question with the same flat, exhausted accuracy, because he had decided on the first day that partial cooperation was worse than none, that the one thing he could control about what came next was the completeness of what he handed over. And he held to that decision through all 17 sessions regardless of what it cost. It cost him considerably. Relationships that had existed for 20 years ended in the space of a phone call when word filtered through the world he was dismantling that he was cooperating. Men he had trusted, or at least relied upon, which in that world had functioned as trust, stopped returning communications, moved their operations, insulated themselves. He understood this. He would have done the same. 2 of his business partners were indicted on charges that his cooperation materially contributed to. He sat with that. There was no version of what he'd agreed to do in which this wasn't a consequence, and he had agreed to it anyway, and sitting with it was part of what he'd agreed to. Marco received a sentence of 3 years, reduced from the original exposure, with the first 18 months served at a minimum security facility in Wisconsin. Before Marco reported in, they sat together for 2 hours in Marco's kitchen. Marco's actual kitchen, the house in Evanston where his daughter had grown up, where her drawings from elementary school were still in a drawer somewhere, where the refrigerator held the kind of ordinary domestic accumulation that Dante's penthouse had never contained. They sat with coffee and they talked about practical matters, the legitimate business assets, the financial arrangements for Marco's daughter's tuition, the transition of certain administrative responsibilities. They did not talk about the betrayal, which had been examined to its limit in the River North office and did not require additional examination. At the end of the 2 hours, Marco stood up and held out his hand and Dante shook it, and that was the full extent of what passed between them on the subject of everything else, which was the right amount. The penthouse sold in month 4 of the cooperation process. He didn't need 42 floors of glass and city view anymore, and more practically, he needed to demonstrate the surrender of assets connected to criminal proceeds. He moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in Lincoln Square, small, quiet, a neighborhood of families and independent restaurants, and a street that was loud on Saturday mornings with a farmer's market. He slept better in that apartment than he had in the penthouse in years, which he attributed to the absence of 42 floors of ambient pressure rather than examining it more closely. The restaurant group, 3 legitimate restaurants on the North Shore, the one genuinely clean business he'd operated for the last decade, largely because he'd liked the original owner and bought it on an impulse, and then discovered he had a functional interest in the mechanics of running a place where people came to eat and left satisfied, survived the process. He restructured it properly, hired a general manager he trusted, stepped back from the day-to-day, and watched it continue to exist as evidence that not everything he'd touched had required the other thing to sustain it. He was sentenced 14 months after signing the cooperation agreement. Federal Courthouse, downtown Chicago. A Tuesday in March that was cold and gray and absolutely ordinary. He stood before the judge with Carver on his left and Marsh on his right, and he listened to the sentence, 5 years, with eligibility for early release at 32 months contingent on continued cooperation. And he said yes, sir, when the judge asked if he understood the terms. And he did. And he had expected nothing more lenient and would not have believed it if it had been. He served 31 months at a federal correctional institution in Indiana. He worked in the facility's administrative office, a position that utilized a set of organizational skills that turned out to be applicable regardless of the context in which they'd originally developed. He read. He wrote letters that were more honest than anything he'd written in his adult life and received, occasionally, responses. He did not ask for special treatment. He did not attempt to leverage old relationships for comfort or advantage. He served the time the way he'd signed the cooperation agreement, completely, without managing the edges. He was released on a Wednesday in September, early morning, into the specific quality of Indiana autumn light that is different from Chicago autumn light in a way that's hard to articulate but present. Carver was there. They drove back to Chicago largely in silence, which suited both of them. He was 58 years old. He had a 2-bedroom apartment in Lincoln Square, a restaurant group on the North Shore, approximately a third of the money he'd had before the cooperation process, and no empire. He stood in his apartment that first night and ate takeout from the Thai place 2 blocks down and watched the street below from the window and felt, with a strange and uncomplicated clarity, like himself. Not a reduced version, not a defeated version. Just the man without the machinery he'd spent 30 years building around himself to avoid having to be exactly this. Ordinary, accountable, standing in a small apartment, eating takeout, entirely responsible for whatever came next. He found out about the gallery from an article in an arts publication he wouldn't have read a year earlier, wouldn't have known it existed. He'd been reading more broadly, in the months since his release, partly from genuine curiosity that had apparently always been there and had simply had no room to exist while he was running an empire, and partly because the restaurant group had expanded into an event space and he'd been learning, practically and extensively, about the arts community in the region. The article was about emerging artists whose work was gaining traction in galleries along the Lake Michigan coast. It was the kind of article that was primarily photographs with secondary text, and he had been about to set it down when he turned the page and saw a painting. A window. Morning light coming through it at a particular angle. The specific, weighted quality of early light that has physical presence. Simple. Technically devastating in what it communicated about the person who made it. The caption read, Elena Moretti, Before the Day Begins, Oil on Canvas, 2027. Gallery Harrow, Harrow Bay. He set the magazine down on the table very carefully, sat with it. Looked out his own window at Lincoln Square in the afternoon and breathed through whatever was moving through his chest, which was complicated enough that he didn't try to name it for several minutes. He did not call. He did not look up a phone number or an address beyond what the article provided, which was the gallery name in the town. He sat with the information for 3 weeks. And then, on a Saturday in late October, he got in his car, his own car now, ordinary, a domestic sedan, and drove 4 hours to the coast. Harrow Bay was a town that had made peace with its own smallness. It had a main street with the kind of shops that served both locals and the periodic influx of people from the city looking for a weekend version of a life less complicated than their own. It had a harbor. It had the particular light that coastal towns have in late October. Horizontal, thin, the quality of light that seems to arrive from a long distance. Gallery Harrow occupied the ground floor of a building near the harbor end of the main street. The window display contained 2 paintings, Neither of them the window painting from the magazine. Both of them in the same language of light and stillness, and the specific vocabulary of a person who had been looking carefully at the world for a long time. He stood outside for a moment, not hesitating, absorbing. He'd driven 4 hours, and he was not going to stand outside the door, so he opened it and went in. The gallery was small. 6 rooms, a soft light system that was doing what it was supposed to do without calling attention to itself. 3 other people were inside. A couple near the back wall, an older man studying something near the entrance. A young woman behind a desk who looked up and said hello in the welcoming but non-intrusive manner of someone trained to let people have their experience. He moved through the first room. The second. The third room had a series of 4 paintings. The Morning Light series, the article had called it. 4 canvases that appeared to be different moments of the same day, observed through the same window over different seasons. They were extraordinary, not in a way that required art education to receive, in the way that things which are genuinely true require no translation. "They're from her apartment," said a voice behind him. "The window faces west, over the water. She's been painting the same window for 2 years. He turned around. Elena was standing in the doorway between the third room and the fourth. She was wearing paint-stained clothes. Not the paint-stained clothes of performance, not the artfully distressed aesthetic of someone performing creativity, but actual work clothes worn by a person who had been in a studio this morning and had come out to walk through the gallery and found someone she hadn't expected. Her hair was different, shorter, less formal. She looked like herself. More specifically, she looked like the person she had been in photographs from before he knew her, which he had studied once, years ago, without understanding what he was seeing. She looked at him with the expression of a person who is not entirely surprised and is deciding what to do with the absence of surprise. "Dante," she said. Not a question. "I'm not here to cause a problem," he said. "I want to be clear about that first." "I know," she said. She came into the room. Not toward him, just into the room, moving to stand at the side of the nearest painting as if she needed something solid adjacent to her. "I heard you were out. I've been following the legal situation for 2 years. "I know you have. Your attorney kept in communication with Carver about the immunity terms." He paused. "I'm glad she did. I wanted you to be able to follow it." Elena looked at him. The afternoon light was coming through the room's single high window. "Why did you come?" He thought about the various true answers to this question and chose the truest one. "To see that you were okay, and to say something that I couldn't say in a letter." She waited. "I'm sorry," he said. He said it the way he had practiced it in the quiet of his apartment and in the long drives he'd taken in the months since release. Not as the opening move of a negotiation, not as the prelude to anything, not as a statement designed to produce a particular response. Just the words, at their actual weight. Not for any specific thing, though there are specific things. For the pattern. For 14 years of looking through you and believing that the absence of conflict was the same as the presence of a marriage. For being the kind of man who confused having everything with understanding anything. Elena was quiet for a moment. She had her arms crossed, not defensively. The posture of a person containing something, managing their own interior the way she had always managed it. With the extraordinary discipline of someone who had never once in his experience lost control of herself in any way that she hadn't chosen. "I know," she said. "I'm not asking for anything," he said. "I want to be clear about that too." "I know that as well." She looked at the painting beside her, one of the window series, the winter one, the light in it spare and cold and very beautiful. "The thing about forgiveness," she said slowly, "is that people assume it's about the other person. Like you forgive someone as a gift to them, a transaction." She paused. "I spent a lot of time angry at you, Dante. Not in the marriage. I was past angry before I left. After. During the investigation. During the trial. There was a period where I read every filing and I felt," she stopped, chose the word carefully, "vindicated. And then at some point, vindication started feeling like a weight, like I was carrying something that didn't belong to me anymore." He said nothing. He understood that this required nothing from him except his full attention, which he gave completely. "I forgive you," she said. She said it plainly, without drama, the way she had written the note on the kitchen counter. Clear, unhurried, the communication of a woman who had chosen her words, and was simply releasing them. Not because you deserve it, or because it changes what happened, because I don't want to carry it anymore. Because the life I've built here, she gestured, a small motion that encompassed the gallery, the light, the paintings, the whole of the town outside the window, doesn't have room in it for the weight of something that's already over. Okay, he said. That's all it is, she said. It's not a door opening. It's me putting something down. I understand, he said. And he did, completely and without qualification, which was perhaps the truest measure of the distance he had traveled from the man who had stood in a kitchen at 4 a.m. with a note in his hand and no framework for understanding what it meant. They stood in the room for a moment. The couple from the back of the gallery moved through, glanced at them with the casual non-attention of people absorbed in art, moved on. The paintings, Dante said. They're what you were always capable of. Elena looked at the Windows series. Something crossed her face. Not pride, not exactly, but the specific expression of a person recognizing something that belongs to them. I know, she said. That's the thing about time. You can waste a great deal of it and still get back to what you were supposed to be doing if you live long enough. Yes, he said. There was a pause between them that was not uncomfortable. The specific pause of two people who have said what needed to be said and are existing for a moment in the aftermath of it. Are you all right? Elena asked. The question was not warm and not cold. It was honest. The question of a person who genuinely wants to know something and has no agenda connected to the answer. I'm getting there, Dante said, which was also honest. She nodded. She moved back toward the doorway between the third room and the fourth. She stopped there and looked back at him with the expression he would remember afterward more clearly than any other detail of the afternoon. Not soft, not hard, not forgiving in any way that implied ongoing connection. Simply the look of a woman who had fully processed something and set it down and was, in the most complete sense he had ever witnessed in another person, free of it. The show runs through December, she said. If you know anyone in Chicago who buys art. A small pause. The prices are reasonable. Something moved through him that might have been the ghost of a smile. I'll mention it. She went through the doorway. He heard her footsteps move through the fourth room, and then a door at the back of the building, and then quiet. He stood in the third room for a moment longer. He looked at the winter painting, the window with the cold light coming through it, the water beyond it barely visible, the whole thing constructed out of a discipline and attentiveness that had been growing quietly inside a person for years, while no one with the authority to notice had bothered to look. Then he walked back through the gallery, past the young woman at the desk who said, "Have a good afternoon," and out into the October street. He drove back to Chicago in the particular low light of a late afternoon that was giving way to early dark. The highway was ordinary, trucks and commuters, and the flat geography of the Midwest in fall, the trees along the median stripped down to their structure, the sky going from blue to gray to the deep indigo of early evening. He thought about Marco, who had been out of the Wisconsin facility for 4 months, and was living in a smaller house in a different suburb and was, by all accounts, building something that resembled a life. They had dinner once a month, the two of them, at a restaurant that belonged to neither of their histories. They talked about Marco's daughter, who was in her 3rd year of college and studying environmental law, which Marco described with the specific pride of a man who understands that what his child is doing is the corrective to what he spent his life doing. They talked about the restaurant group and the event space and the ordinary complications of legitimate business. They did not talk about the past with any frequency, because the past had been examined in full, and what remained of it was simply the record of what had happened, which didn't require further analysis. He thought about Hess, who had been given what he'd asked for, a letter from Carver confirming no pursuit of civil claims, and who had disappeared from Dante's awareness entirely, which was the outcome Hess had wanted and which Dante had decided required no further complication. He thought about Cutler, who had backed down from the secondary package threat and whose subsequent legal difficulties, unrelated to Dante, arising from a separate federal investigation in New York, had consumed whatever attention and resources he might otherwise have directed elsewhere. Dante had learned about the New York investigation from a brief item in a financial newspaper 3 months after his release. He had noted it and returned to his breakfast, and felt nothing in particular about it, which was probably the most honest measure of how much he had changed. He was 58 years old. He had a restaurant group, a small apartment, 200 and some pages of cooperation testimony on record with the U.S. Department of Justice, and 31 months of Indiana behind him. He had a brother who was rebuilding and a niece who was going to be formidable in ways neither of them could fully anticipate. He had somewhere in a gallery in a coastal town the specific form of closure that comes not from resolution but from completion, the sense that a thing has reached its actual end and that the end is honest and that honesty, even when it costs everything, is the only version of anything worth having. The Chicago skyline appeared on the horizon, the specific cluster of it, the density of light against the dark sky. He had been looking at that skyline his entire life, had built things in that city, had broken things in that city, had stood on the 42nd floor of a building in that city and believed that the altitude meant something about the quality of his position in the world. He took the exit toward Lincoln Square, drove through the neighborhood streets, found a parking space half a block from his building, the kind of small, ordinary urban victory that he had learned in his two-bedroom apartment on a street with a Saturday farmer's market to appreciate without irony. He sat in the parked car for a moment, not because he needed to, because the evening was quiet and the street was quiet, and the interior of the moment was quiet, and he had discovered in the last 31 months that quiet, which he had once interpreted as absence, was actually its own variety of thing worth sitting with. He got out of the car, walked half a block in the October air, let himself into his building, up the stairs. He took the stairs, had been taking stairs since Indiana, the small discipline of it, and into his apartment. He made coffee, stood at his kitchen window and looked at the street below, which was ordinary and lit by ordinary streetlights and contained the ordinary foot traffic of a neighborhood on a Saturday evening. A woman with a stroller, two men talking outside a bar, a kid on a bicycle ignoring the bike lane with the sovereign indifference of adolescence. He drank his coffee. He thought about Elena's paintings, the Morning Light series, the 4 of them in sequence, the way she had taken a single window and found in it enough variation and depth to sustain 4 separate truths about what light does to the world depending on the season. He thought about what she'd said. You can waste a great deal of it and still get back to what you were supposed to be doing if you live long enough. He didn't know, standing at his kitchen window at 58 with a coffee cup, what he was supposed to be doing. He had a clearer sense of what he was not supposed to be doing. Not supposed to be building structures designed to keep consequences at a distance. Not supposed to be looking through people as though their interiority was beside the point. Not supposed to be confusing power with understanding or control with love. What he was supposed to be doing affirmatively in the actual construction of a life going forward, that was less clear. He understood that the lack of clarity was appropriate, that he had spent 30 years believing certainty was the measure of his authority, and had discovered in the most comprehensive way available that certainty built on the wrong foundations was not certainty, but simply a longer fall. He washed the coffee cup, put it away, stood in the kitchen of his small apartment for a moment, in the quiet that was its own kind of thing, and then went to the window one more time and looked at the street. The kid on the bicycle was gone. The 2 men outside the bar had gone inside. The woman with the stroller had turned the corner. The street held its ordinary evening self. The streetlights, the parked cars, the lit windows of the buildings on the other side suggesting the ordinary interiors of people living ordinary lives with their ordinary complications, none of which were visible from this angle, and all of which were. He understood now in a way he had not understood before Indiana, and the cooperation sessions, and the empty penthouse, and the note on the kitchen counter, as real and as consequential as anything he had ever built. He turned off the kitchen light, went to bed. Outside, the city continued its breathing, the specific, enormous, indifferent breath of a place that contains everything and remembers nothing, in which 2 people had built a life together and dismantled it and walked away from the wreckage into separate futures, and in which those futures were unfolding at this moment in ways that required no further witness. One of them was in a small coastal town, in an apartment with a west-facing window, in a studio that smelled of oil paint and the particular salt air that came off the lake in the morning, adding a brushstroke to something that had been years in the making and was, stroke by stroke, becoming itself. The other was in a small apartment in Lincoln Square, in the dark, with the city outside his window and the rest of his life in front of him, which was shorter than it had been and more honest than it had ever been, and was, for the first time, entirely and only his own.